Good afternoon. My name is Troy Miles. Today I'm going to be talking about using JQuery Mobile, Backbone, and ASPNET MVC to do mobile web applications. A little bit about myself before I start. I've been programming for over 30 years professionally. I got my start back in like 1978 or 79 when I was still in high school, and I wrote a program for my local school and actually sold it on a Commodore PET 2001. So I see all the people that have been around for a while know what a Commodore PET is. This is right about the same time as Apple, the original Apple II. Not a 2 plus or a 2E or a 2C, but a 2 period. And since that time, I've done lots of game development for the Defense Department, development. Right now, I'm a senior software engineer at Kelly Blue Book, and I'm currently on the lead programmer on the mobile team. The 10 of us, and only 4 of us are actually software engineers, are responsible for the Kelly Blue Book iOS app, the Kelly Blue Book Android app, and the WinPhone 7 app, and also the mobile site. So we're really busy. We know a lot about mobile, and we stay busy. So today I'm going to give you a little glimpse of how we do things there, if you want to do it yourself, what you should do, and give you enough software toys to play with to get you started. The code that I'm going to show you will be uploaded, and there will be a link put on the socal.net under the session for this session. There will be a link tomorrow morning. I was doing, as I said, the last minute revisions. I can't stop playing with my own code. Because the hardest thing in doing a session like this actually is just taking out enough so that it's easy to digest, but not taking out too much so that it doesn't mean anything. It's not relevant. And the pieces that I'm going to give you now, while it's all stripped down and it's simplified, it's enough that if you wanted to do your own app, if you're thinking, hey, my company, myself, I want to start a business or do something like that and create my own mobile website, this code will give you just enough to get started so that you'll have the framework that you need to put together in a smart and easy to manage fashion. Okay, and just to show of hands, how many people here are familiar with either JQuery or JQuery Mobile? And have actually used it? Okay, one of the good things about JQuery is, for those that don't know, JQuery is sort of a DOM manipulation utility, is what I like to think of it as. It's something that allows you to manipulate your HTML in a dynamic fashion, to change it, to modify it, to search for certain tags on your page and make corrections to it. And that's all well and great. Unfortunately, it also can lead to code that is very difficult to maintain. And the reason is because everything in JQuery, there's probably 30 different ways to do it. And every engineer on your team will choose a different one, and some of them will choose 2 or 3 to do the same exact thing, like how to click on a button or how to do this. So there's lots and lots of different ways. And plus, when you add that to the fact that you have things like, you can just do it in straight up JavaScript. You don't need to do it and use jQuery here. It can lead to some really, really hard to maintain and hard to manage schedule. And that's, one of the things that we're going to try to stop. And I'm going to hopefully give you some tips on how to do that. So our goals today are going to be, we want to present the best possible user experience. And to quote my friends at Google, speed is the best feature. When you're dealing with mobile, you have to think almost like thinking 20 years ago with the web. People aren't sitting around, and regardless of what the carriers say about 4G and 3G and whatever, anytime you have to do a communication over a cell phone back to a server somewhere, it is slow, period. So you want to minimize the amount of data that you're ever transmitting over the wire. You want to make it so that when you do transmit, you get everything that you need at once. And you want to try to stop the sort of chattiness where somebody looks at their phone and they go to your site and there's constantly a little thing spinning and they're watching their battery drain down, because using the battery on a cell phone is exceptionally expensive. Next to the display, it's the most expensive thing that you can do. So you want to do it as infrequently as possible. And to that end, my first thing that I'm going to tell you is, Everything that you know about MVC, forget it. MVC is really, it's a great product. I like Microsoft's product. I use Visual Studios. I don't know how many people notice, but I'm using a Mac, but I actually use Visual Studios on it. But the problem is, if you do things, if you follow the best practices and the recommendations of Microsoft on a mobile site, you will kill your users. You will create a dreadful experience. And the reason for that is, if you set up things on a page-by-page basis, what's going to happen is somebody clicks a link, goes to the server, grabs some, a page, brings it down, and then you go to the next page. And then they click on another page, and you do that. And instead, what I'm going to recommend, and one of the things that jQuery Mobile is very helpful in allowing you to do, is to create a single-page app. Once we bring down all the markup to the user's browser, we never get any more markup. We get data, and we get that data back in the form of JSON. And this brings me to the next thing that I'll tell you. Be careful with Razor, because Razor's cut. Razor's a great tool. It's a great tool for building enterprise apps. It's not a great tool for building web apps. And the reason for that is that it does all of its construction on the server. So when you create those fancy little templates, and again, 4 lines of code, you spit out a whole grid, and it's got rows and columns and all of this. The problem is that all that's rendered on the server, and then it's sent over the wire. At Kelly Blue Book, we did some tests on the stuff that I'm working on, and we found by doing our rendering on the client, we instantly cut off 40%. And depending on what kind of a thing you're rendering, you can cut out even more than that. And the reason is, it's like, for instance, if you have a bunch of list views, so you've got a bunch of listed data like we typically see in a business type application. For each piece of data, you're wrapping it in LIs and sometimes classes and sometimes A tags and all this other stuff. And all that stuff is coming with the data. And so it causes the data to expand. And it also causes your server to work because it's got to make all that data. And instead, what we do is we take the JSON and we just do an AJAX call. And this is where the backbone part of this comes in. We just do an AJAX call, grab the data, and then we do it on the client. Because all of these phones, whether you have a Droid, you have an iPhone, or Windows Phone 7, have some pretty powerful processors for it. Even the ones that are like several years old can render an HTML page fairly easily. So we talked about giving the user the best experience, to lower our server utilization, and then finally we want to make it easy to maintain. And part of that is the framework that this code is going to present. You want to both have a place to start yourself when you're coding something up, and as you're maintaining things, as other people are coming and going from your team as you're developing this application, you want to give them a place to start. And that's one of the hardest things to do, so you don't know where in a web app, where's the beginning? Because there's no main. There's no little line of code somewhere that says main and you start following from there. Things seem like they're going on all over the place. There's different pages. The DOM's getting manipulated. Things are changing even as you click on stuff, as you watch the DOM. And so we're going to, in order to ease our maintenance, we're going to put everything in a nice framework that makes it sensible. Where to find out where pages are starting at, where things are ending at, and if I want to modify something or add something, if the business people come on and say, you know what would be great? If we had a page that did this, you'll go, oh, no problem. And then exactly what to do, and where to add this page at and how to make it work. Some of the things that we're not going to cover. Even though this is technically an HTML5 app, I'm not going to talk to you about location services, about local storage, about all the other things that are HTML5 goodness. I'm not going to talk about client-side validation. So this app that I'm going to give you, it's raw native. If you type something that's garbage, for the most part, it will let you do so. Unfortunately, client-side validation is easily the subject for a whole other talk, if not two, because there's multiple different ways to do it. There's ways that the MVC will recommend. There's, in fact, MVC3, they started including the JQuery validation library. But that gets into a whole ball of wax that I don't cover. The other thing is I'm not going to talk about SQL Server, any other databases, entity frameworks, in Hibernate, or anything like that. In fact, this app's database is a dictionary. It's stripped down, it's naked, it's easy to understand. If you want to go ahead and take it home and play with it, on a weekend morning or something, you can add a database layer to it. But it's all put in the models class. And I'm not going to talk about things like security. And security is actually very important in an app like this. I would not use this kind of an app to do something that needs to be secure. So if you're working for a bank or the government or some other places where you don't want people's information or data splayed out over the web, don't do it in this kind of app. The reason is because we're going to put everything in the client, in the browser. Now this is good for business, like line of business apps, where we're showing the person data. We've got free information on our website. We're giving this information away for free because you're sticking everything in the client. And if you put banking information or something like that, and somebody like me gets a hold of it, well, I'll have your server doing all kinds of tricks it didn't know it could do. So don't use this kind of thing for an app that needs to be secure. Okay, so the tools that I use and just to put together this app are, of course, ASPNET MVC. And this is basically this is going to be the most retarded version of MVC you've ever seen. I am not using any of its tricks. I'm not using filters or pipes or attributes. I'm not doing anything tricky, sneaky, things that other engineers are going to go, ooh, how'd you get it to do that? And the reason is, I believe servers should be dumb. The more work you do on the server, the more servers you're going to need when you go live in production. And this is one of those things that's really hard to convince engineers of. I see people get carried away. They have a call to a server and they're making 5 to 6 different back-end calls, sometimes calling out to third-party databases, services, and they're wondering why their app is slow. And they beg me to come over and help them, give them a hand to make this faster, because all the test users are complaining that it's slow, and it's like, well, you're doing too much. So this is, like I said, I very fervently believe that your server-side code should be as dumb as possible. It should be as quick as possible. It should just grab some data and then basically go away. But to that end, don't be stupid yourself. You want to make sure that when you do a call to a database, if you need 10 records, don't do a call and grab 100 and then strip off 10 when it gets to the client. You want to do your filtering of data as close to the data as you can in the SQL call or whatever kind of call you're making in the back end. But you don't want to do too much gathering of data and too many calls out to too many services, because this will kill people on phones. The second part of this is JQuery. As I said, JQuery is what I like to just think of as just a very fancy DOM manipulator. It does all kinds of things. It makes your web page come alive. Then the third part of this is JQuery Mobile. And I know that all of you, or at least most of you, have heard of it. Those that don't, it's basically a plugin to jQuery that does things, that's aware of phones and its events and things that it can do and how to configure things on the screen. And one of the things that it does is it stands as a buffer between you and the browsers and sort of unifies most of the things. And I will tell you, it's still kind of the Wild West when it comes to browsers on phones. And I will also have to admit that Android is the worst offender of it. I spent the last 3 days trying to find a bug in some code that was as plain simple as could be, but it was not working on 2 Android phones. And the bug that it had was different on each of them. And it took 3 days to figure out a way to both fix the bug and not introduce any bugs in the other phones. We have 20 different phones that we test on. And it was just 2 of them that it wasn't running right. And it's mainly because device manufacturers don't really care one way or another about the web to a certain degree. And they do things and they implement things, and sometimes their browser is a version or 2 behind what Google has already put out. So you're going to have to do, if you release an app, you're going to do a lot of testing. If you do it by yourself and you're working at home, my suggestion is dog food it to your friends. Put it out there somewhere that they can publicly get access to it, and start, next time you see friends at the party, you go, oh, this guy's Troy, he's got a Nexus X. Figure out what kind of phones that your friends have and keep a listen, because you will find that there's, regardless, even on 2, we had one of the bugs, like I said, the bug that I was trying to find, worked on one Samsung Galaxy S for the Verizon version, did not work on the Samsung Galaxy S on the AT&T network, because there were slight differences between the two. I know somebody was saying that these lights come on and off every hour. Continuing on, there's underscore. Now, underscore is basically those who have been around for a while and are used to things like the standard template library. That's basically kind of what underscore is. A set of utilities that do lots and lots of things that if you're ever going to do client-side coding to the extreme, you're going to, for instance, it does things like set manipulation. So if you have a list of objects and you want to go through each one of those objects and do something to it, it's got all kinds of things for manipulating sets, for pulling one value out, for doing things like that. And it's also a requirement for Backbone. Backbone and underscore were written by the same person whose name, for the life of me, I can't remember right now. He was a really smart guy. He wrote both of them, and he made a requirement that Backbone needs underscore because he's using stuff in underscore for Backbone. And then there's following Backbone. Backbone is sort of like the client-side version of MVC. It does models, it does views, it does collections, and it also does routing. We're not going to talk about routing at all, because that gets into another long subject over. And it also even gets into a little bit of a software engineering religious quandary about what's the correct way to put a URL in somebody's address bar. And it gets to be a really complicated subject, especially because different browsers implement history and push things slightly differently, and it's painful at times. So we're not going to talk about the routing, but we will talk about models, views, and collections. And one of the things that Backbone does, anyone who's ever done Ajax in JavaScript, it makes it just plain stupid easy to do Ajax. To have some objects, you create a model, which is an object, you create groups of these, which is a collection, and you can have them update themselves back and forth to the client without you basically doing hardly anything, like 1 or 2 lines of code. And this is where it uses a REST pattern. So this is the reason why my server-side stuff is so dumb, because all it does is implement HTTP GET, POST, PUT, and delete. And the Backbone takes care of all of that. And in fact, when I first used it, one of the guys I worked with first introduced me to it, and I did the little demo app that we were talking about, and oh my God, it was so easy. I was like, this can't be this easy. It's got to be a trick. And I'm checking it in Fiddler and double checking it. It's like, nope, it seems to work right all the time. That it's smart about how it does URL. Sorry, we talked about MVC, JQuery, JQuery Mobile, underscore, finally Backbone. And the last line is a little bit of a misquote where it says requires underscore and JQuery. It could also, there's other plugins that it could use, but for me, since I use jQuery and I have no desire to use like Prototype or any of the other plugins, JavaScript plugins, you could use one of those, and if you're familiar with it or more comfortable with it, please do so. And all of this stuff is, except for MVC, is open source, it's free, and it's also a great way to learn how other engineers do things. If you use jQuery Mobile or any of these other utilities, take the time to get the full expanded debugging version of the source. And occasionally, like underscore and Backbone both are very small, and it's easy to go through them, and you learn all kinds of tricks. Like,
Sure, MVC is open source as well.
Oh, it is. Even I learned things here. That's why I love coming to CodeCamp. Okay, invariably, whenever I talk about the mobile web, people ask about, well, mobile apps. And I'm kind of in a weird, unique, and hard-working position simply because my team does both. And I will tell you now that they don't have to be, it's either one or the other. You do a mobile website or you do a mobile app. Because we have both. And I can tell you right now, people hit both of them. We've got lots of people visiting our mobile website that have iPhones, that have Androids, even though we have a mobile app available. Even though on our mobile app, our mobile website, we say, hey, we have this, we have an app that will do all this stuff you're doing here. Because sometimes, well, there's lots of different reasons. One of the reasons is that people don't like taking up valuable space on their SD card. Sometimes they found your site as a result of a Google search. But like I said, they can be complementary. What we do is on our back-end servers, both our device apps for the different devices and our website, the same server feeds both of them. We're making pretty much the same exact queries. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why we got our Android app up so quickly, because we just used all the same calls that we were using on our website in our app, and basically just make the data a little bit prettier. So you can do both, and they can also be, like I said, complementary, so that you can sit there and feed people the same data, and you can advertise one or the other, because sometimes you forget your phone or whatever. And the other thing that we found was at Kelly Blue Book, we of course have our main cash cow website, kdb.com, and there are people from desktops that prefer the mobile site because we're quicker. You can get through clicks much faster, get the information if you're looking for the value for your vehicle, to find out more information about a vehicle on our mobile site than you can on our desktop site. And then the other thing that you can always do is you can be a light version of your device. So especially if your company has an app and it's making money off it, you of course don't want to go, I'm going to give this away for free now because I'm tired of money. I've got enough. You can just do a lighter version on the web and advertise, hey, here's a link that you can go to get the actual application, get the rest of the data or whatever it is that you're selling. So let's talk a little bit about the app itself. Okay, so this is the app. It's just a contacts app. So we're just dealing with a single list of information, which are contacts. It's right now I'm running it on Chrome because it's easier for me to show things and debug things in Chrome. And this is also one of the things that I'm going to recommend is that whenever you do this stuff, you first want to sort of test it out on your desktop. Once it's fine, then because you can debug kind of sort of on either an iPhone or an Android phone, but it's like nothing that you want to do. You can't hit debugging points. You can't hit do a console and start logging deep into and looking at nested objects to see what's inside of them. So you don't want to use either the phones or the simulators or the emulators to do your actual development. You usually want to use a browser that's very supportive. In the case of Chrome, I have plugins that, for instance, allow me to set the screen size so that I can set it to a 320, 480. I can set it to, and I also set it to whatever size that I want it to, so that I can simulate and emulate to get a kind of a feel for what data is going to look like on different screens. Plus, I have things like YSlow. YSlow is a great plugin, and it's also a great website. It will tell you things that you're doing wrong in order to make your app as fast as possible. And of course, Chrome comes with a really good, and I shouldn't just say Chrome, it's all the WebKit browsers have a real good debuggings. So I can see all the elements on the screen. I can go to a console and start hitting stuff. I can also see what all my network calls look like, what kind of resources that I've used and load it down. So for instance, if I'm using HTML5 local storage, I can dive into the local storage to see how much memory I'm taking up and things like that. And so Chrome's a very essential tool for mobile development and any sort of mobile development in general.
What was the tool you have for the screensavers?
Okay, yeah, let's just go there. This guy, I'm trying to remember what this plugin is called, sorry. Now everybody knows all my tools, including the essential HTML5 video filter. Man does not live by code alone. So, okay, this is our app. Like I said, right now the only thing that it does, and it'll be up to you as a homework assignment to expand it to do more, is it has a list of a singular list of contacts. We have an add contact page. If we say add another person, go back and we look, third guy down is our good friend Frank Blank. So it added it, it updated the DOM, it put all that stuff in there, and a lot of that stuff happens on its own. It's just a personal, it's a best practice and it's a personal belief that you want to make objects responsible as much as you can for taking care of themselves. If you have too much information spread over too many files or too many things, too many different objects, it's a coding nightmare. So let's start taking an actual look at how this application is put together. As I said before, this is just a very plain, very simple MVC backend. It's not doing a lot. As you can see, I've only got two controllers. The first controller, API controller, is a controller that's responsible for managing the contacts collection. That's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. If we take a look at it, you guys all see this pretty well. It's always one of my pet peeves when I come to these kinds of things, is getting to that age where I can't see close or far. So it's got 4 methods, and is everybody familiar with HTTP verbs? So, especially in a RESTful pattern, you have, there's more than 4, but there's 4 main important ones. And they are get, post, put, and delete. Your get is when you want to get information. Pretty self-explanatory. Post is when you're putting a new record into your collection. Put is when you're updating each of these records. Methods is very, very small. It's making one reference, and that's to Contact Manager, and we'll take a look at that in just 1 second. But for the most part, they don't do very much. And that is purposeful and intentional. And also, it gets into my other beliefs, and that is if you're going to teach somebody how to do something, give them the simple example first. Don't put too much stuff. Otherwise, people aren't sure where to get started at. And so this is like, I'm sure that there are people out there that go, oh, well, I put an entity framework behind this and whatever, and that's great. So let's, I'd like to see what you come up with. Please do. Take this stuff all to the next level. So in our Contact Manager, I started everything off. I seed the database with 10 records, and they're just 10 names. They all have the same phone number because I don't know, they live in the same house and nobody has a cell phone. And like I said, this app does not do very much. It just, you create records. Create records. You can create a list of records, potentially. You can update a record. You can get the entire list, and you can delete a record. That's it. So it's really easy to keep track of what's going on, and we can also watch as data is being transmitted back and forth to the server that it's going straight to just 1 and 2. There's not a lot of complicated things going on here. So switching to the client side, we start off with our model. As I said, Backbone consists of models, views, and collections. So our model doesn't do very much. Backbone, you start off with a class called model. The model class, you want to extend it, and that's just some JavaScript parlance. And I will be honest and admit right now that if I was writing this code right now for myself, I wouldn't use JavaScript, I'd use CoffeeScript, but I didn't want to add one more layer of complexity. So I wrote it all in JavaScript. Extend just basically says you've got some sort of an object, and usually in JavaScript, one of the ways that you do objects is you have basically a key value list, which is just something that I think every language has. A dictionary is an example of it. And then when you say expand, it says take that list of things and then just add this new thing I'm telling you to it. So in this case, the only thing the initialize function does is it creates a variable called created at, and gives it the time And in this case, it's going to be the time in milliseconds since 1970, which is the way that JavaScript does in the browser. So the model's pretty simple. Can't ask for anything. There's nothing really complicated going on there, so it's pretty easy to get your head around. A collection is just a set of models. So in this case, we extend from backbone collection. We tell it what our model is, and in this case, it's a tech-dev contact, which is the file we just seen previously. And we have to tell it one more critical piece of information, which is the URL to go to get to talk to in order to get data, save data, post data. And so what goes on behind the scenes is anytime it says, hey, I just got a new model, I need to save this off somewhere, it's going to go to API contacts. Likewise for the delete, it's going to just do the delete verb on that. So if we continue on, and then there's just a few other things we do. This right here is the abstract class. And then in here, where I say tech-dev small letters, contact, is where I actually create an instance of this class. And then there's one last thing that we do. All backbone collections can have something called a comparator. And what a comparator does is exactly what its name says. You tell it how to sort data. And every time it either adds data to your list of objects in your collection, it will put it in the order based upon what the comparator says to do. So in this case, I told it to sort everything based on last name and first name. And that's why the contacts list maintained itself in alphabetical order. Frank Blank was inserted right in the third position. And it was because of the comparator. I'm sorry, yes?
I don't know if it's just what I've seen. Are those periods before and after the equal signs in your white space?
Those processes represent the white space.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're talking about in...
On the code, yeah.
Yeah, I have white space visible set on in my editor. Especially like in my team at work, we have programs always like to divide themselves into two camps. I don't know what this is, but in our case, it's those who use spaces and those who use tabs. Guess which group I'm in. And this comes from long time doing JavaScript, where in the days before minifiers, you had to do all the minification yourself. I learned that spaces take up a lot more room than tabs. And not to mention tabs are easier for another reason, just because people can set tab with whatever they're comfortable with. So I've seen people with them at 2, some people with them at 8, depending on what kind of screen you have and how you like stuff organized. That's all you're seeing is I've made my white space visible. So that's our collection. Our collection is pretty simple. Most of the grunt work, most of the hard work is done for you in backbone. So we don't really have to do anything in this case. The view gets a...
So you go back to the
Sure.
lab, you had that, or take a left equals, take a left, double type, pretty great, 911. What are you doing with that?
Okay, this is a namespace. In JavaScript, especially whenever you use a lot of open source libraries, you want to do something to protect yourself because, for instance, imagine you had a function called print. What are the odds that you might get somebody else in one of the other libraries also has a function called print? The great thing about JavaScript is JavaScript is a harsh mistress. Whenever you do something wrong, she doesn't say anything to you at all. A lot of the time in the browser, so it's just kind of like you guess what you did wrong. So what happens is when you have a name collision like that, where you have a function called print, and some open source library or another developer on your team has a function called print, is he who put their print in last wins. And I won't tell you which one that was. Sometimes, and the thing is, people always say, well, it's based on the order of the files. Yes and no. It also is based upon what things are doing, because for instance, if you do things like closures, where you have a function or a method or something that's wrapped inside of another method, and inside that method, you create something called print, and you put it in the global space. When the browser first goes through and examines your JavaScript, it doesn't exist. Later on, when that function gets called and you create that global print, that's when it gets done. So it may not necessarily be in the order that the files are put in. So one of the things that you do is you always want to try to wrap create your own namespace. And usually the recommendation is it's whatever your company is, or your name, or your favorite dog out of your 10, which, whatever makes you happy, but do something so that it makes the odds of a name collision less. It doesn't guarantee that it doesn't, because if you call it Fido.print and somebody else on another team, somewhere else, in some open source library also has a dog named Fido, you're still a host, but it's much less likely to occur. Okay, so on to our view. Our view gets a little bit more complicated, but we can walk through this and it's not that bad. Also, you'll notice that at the top of things, sometimes I have things like bars, and they're just defined up there. What that's for is I use a tool called JSLint. JSLint will save your life, but it will also make you cry. What it does is it does exactly what its name says. It goes through your JavaScript, takes a look at it, tells you everything you did wrong. You can set like little parameters, like depending on what your coding style is, your team's coding style, you can change things up on it. It's located at jslint.com. It'll be on the links in the last page. And it's written by a guy named Douglas Crockford, Douglas Crockford, who was the chief, or probably still is, chief architect at Yahoo back in the days when Yahoo was still somebody. They actually developed a lot of really good tools for front-end development. Yeah. And also that why slow that shoot, that's done too. These variables here are basically just tell JSLint that, hey, I've got this global thing called the $, which is JQuery, backbone, and console. So don't freak out when you see it. So just like we've done before, we've seen this pattern now a little bit. We're going to talk to something called backbone.view. Makes sense? The model is backbone.model, the collection is backbone.collection, the view is backbone.view. We're going to extend it. There's just some things more that you have to do in a view in order to get it to work right. So one thing is you should always have an initialize function. The console.logs, these are just there to make programmers like me who are not sure if things are going the way that I thought they were going, spit something out, let me know that everything's all right, and I would never put these in there on a piece of production code. Not to mention on our minification, we have it set to just strip those out. The very first thing that we need to talk about is templates. As I said, we do most of the rendering most of the rendering in the client. One of the ways that you're going to keep your sanity is if you put things in templates. We do the templates in two parts. The first part is inside of our actual HTML. We do a little separation of concerns here. And this okay, so right here is our template. So you see a script tag, inside of the script tag, something that kind of looks like the old ASPX templates in MVC, or if you're a Ruby person. Are there any Ruby people in the room? Don't be afraid. You're safe here from your emotions. Ruby's cool. I actually like Ruby, and I learned a lot from learning. Or it looks like Ruby templates as well. But one of the things you'll notice is that it says text./template. If you look that up on the internet, you won't find any reference to something called the text/template. One of the things that you want to make sure of with your template is that the browser doesn't try to do anything. And because I give it a tag that it doesn't recognize, it won't do anything with it. The default state in HTML is anytime a browser encounters something it doesn't know what it is, just leave it alone. It's not for me. That's the whole secret of how Flash works, how Silverlight works.
Well, like JS.
Yes, actually, yes, it is.
Have you heard of Simply?
I haven't heard of Simply. Yeah, a lot of this stuff, I think it's kind of true. Like, most people don't realize that at the time, like when the Wright brothers invented the airplane, there were several other people that were working on planes as well. It wasn't like they just had an idea. what if we had a machine that could fly? No, it was that the time was just about right. And likewise, this is what's going on a lot in the open source community. People start running into the same issue, and some of the more hardworking people, hats off to them, that don't have girlfriends or like weekends, start coming up with this great open source code that does all these kinds of things like knockout, and I guess simply, and JQuery, and backbone, and underscore, and all this other stuff that we get for free if you use. It solves a lot of problems. And then the other thing that we have here is just an ID. The ID is how we can find this, and we'll use jQuery to find it. So this guy here basically gets compiled into JavaScript. JavaScript is a very strange and beautiful and mysterious language that is dangerous in the wrong hands. One of the things that you can actually do is you can take text and basically do what's called an eval on it. Now, this eval occurs somewhere deep in the guts of _JS. And what it's going to do is it's going to expand out these templates for us, compile it into some runnable JavaScript, and then we feed it some data, and magically on the screen that list of contacts appears. So if you now looking at this guy, you can see how all of this guy got rendered. You see that we have a class contact, which actually at this point does nothing. In fact, I didn't need to put it there because I could have had backbone do that for me automatically. And I don't know what I was thinking about when I did that. But each of the, basically what's going to go on is there's going to be an each, which basically iterates through a loop, like a for each loop in C#, and it's going to spit out each of these rows complete with their markup. Now, everybody here should be able to just go, yeah, that would be a lot smaller than generating it on the server in Razor and sending it down to the client, because it's happening on the client rather than on the server. So your server actually gets some of its load like that. Your user gets a faster, more responsive website because the data gets down to them quicker, and it still renders much quicker than it would sending it down to the server. And it's fairly easy to maintain. That's why it's in this file, because it's HTML, even though it's not rendered yet. A little separation of concerns. I could have put this all in just a string and still had it spit it out, and it would have been fine with it. But later on, when somebody says, we shouldn't be using the contact class, we should be using the contact plus class, good luck finding it in your JavaScript, and getting it all maintained a lot. Whereas in here, it makes sense because it's with the rest of the markup. So go back to the view class. We're not through with it yet. So we've seen our template, and the template at this point is just a value. It's holding that markup. It hasn't actually rendered anything to the screen yet. The next two things that we do is we're binding to two events. The reset event occurs anytime a collection doesn't fetch. So anytime the collection goes off, grabs a bunch of data, we're going to say, hey, it generates a reset event, and we're telling it when that reset event occurs, go ahead and render yourself. The second thing we're guiding to is a change event. The change event occurs when something gets added to or subtracted to the collection, and we're saying go ahead and render yourself again. So anytime this guy gets rendered, it comes down in here using its template. And everybody's familiar with the this, right? It's pretty much the same thing as it is in C#, where it's an object reference to itself. Although in JavaScript, you always have to be careful with this, because this isn't always pointing to the this you think it's pointing to. But in this case, in backbone, it always is. It's a reference to the object itself. And we basically say, hey, take my collection, convert all the data into it to JSON, and give it a reference called contact. So if you remember from the markup, it was using a thing called contacts as an iterator for the loop, and then it gets each one of those, it calls a contact, and then it just spits out the data. And then finally, this last little bit of code here, where it says list view refresh, that is for jQuery mobile. jQuery mobile does a lot of markup manipulation. So as it's applying things and it's doing things, it goes through it and puts classes to things. Because we just injected this code onto the DOM, it didn't have a chance to do anything to it. So if we didn't have that refresh there, the code it would still show up, but it would look naked. with all of the styles applied to it. So that's what that last little bit does, is it just tells it tells jQuery Mobile, hey, take a look at this thing I just gave you, this list view, go through and put your own markup on it. And then finally, this is the same pattern that we've seen before, where the thing up above was just the abstract. Now we actually want to create one, and then we're going to stick it in TechDev contacts collection view. And we tell it again, oops, here's the guy that you're a view for. And then one more thing that we tell it is here's where you want to render yourself to. EL is a special variable inside of Backbone, which tells a view where to render. So in this case, it's a singular place. It's an ID that's on my markup. It could also be things like if you had a class and you wanted anywhere that class appeared, you wanted to render a list out, and you could put it on multiple places, and they would all get updated. So there's lots of different things that you can put in EL, but in this case, it's just a singular instance of the contacts list view, which is this guy here. Okay, now we get to, this is the piece of the code that gets the golden ring as far as probably the most important piece of information. The question is, you have HTML and you have JavaScript. You want certain things to happen as certain pages render themselves, as page events occur. As pages get ready to go, you want to get rid of events, you want to do things, you want to hook certain buttons or whatever. How do you know when to do what you want to do? You could write one big giant piece of JavaScript that's always running and always active, or you can split the JavaScript down into pages. Like the HTML is broken into pages, you can also break up your JavaScript into pages, and the way that the pages know what's going on is this little guy called the kernel. And the kernel does nothing but this fact. It listens to the jQuery Mobile's events. jQuery Mobile events go through a bunch of page life cycles. As it goes through these life cycles, all I do is say, hey, call this guy in the kernel and tell him that, that this event has occurred. So you notice that all of these are references to the same guy, the same method. And that method is this guy here. And he does a little bit of trickery, and then also a little bit of safety netting. He sits there and he listens and he gets the event. He figures out what kind of event it is from the event type. And he grabs what is this little piece of markup. In HTML5, you can have an attribute of your own. And the recommendation is that you've got to call it data dash, and then something that identifies it uniquely. In this case, it's going to be TechDev.js pages. What that little attribute does is on my pages it says, this is the piece of JavaScript I want you to execute when this page gets rendered. And we can see that in the markup. As I said, this app is a single page app, and it has multiple virtual pages that are all handled by jQuery Mobile. Each of the pages is just simply a div. It has a data role of page. It has things like data DOM, cache means. This page, just in case I had other pages that I needed to fetch from the server, it says keep this page in memory too. So that when the user goes back to that page, it doesn't have to do another server-side fetch. It's just going to start executing the code. As we slide over just a little bit more, back and go down one notch, we see a piece of markup that we don't recognize, which is the TechDev.js page, and it says add contact. So what it's looking for is somewhere in my code, there's something called add contact. And if I look, right now I've got, generally speaking, if I was doing this for real at work, each of these pages handlers would be a separate piece of JavaScript to itself, and we use comres to combine all of our JavaScripts into one and minimize it and spit it down. But for the sake of this talk, we've got them all into one. So as we look through here, each of these pages is named a certain way, which is TechDev pages, and here's add contact. And that kernel is the guy that says, hey, look, I've got a piece of I've got a div page that's named that has add contact in its name. Find me the JavaScript that matches it, and then call this event on that bit of JavaScript. And what that does is it allows everybody on your team to know where to put things, how to start a page off, because you go through the page lifecycle, which has a bunch of events. These are basically in order: before create, init, before load, before show, before change, before hide. And what happens is, as you go from page A to page B, it's going to go back and forth in the page it's going through a set of events, so that you can unhook your events if you need to, or you can hook events if you need to. And then as it gets all through, it's going to just be on show of whatever the page it was going to. All of these events don't need to be here, because the code in the kernel is smart enough to know that if this event is not in this handler, don't bother trying to call it, because there's no point, because we'll just crash, and that's not good. So that's what the kernel code was doing, is it's looking to see, first off, does the tech-adept variable exist? Does the tech-adept pages variable exist? Does this virtual page have a JavaScript page associated? You might have a page that doesn't do anything. It just shows a corporate logo or something. And in that case, you don't want it to do anything. And so you might just have it not have any JavaScript that it executes. So that guy's got to exist. Once all of those guys exist, it takes a look to see if that page name, if the page name exists. So now it's looking to see if tech-adept pages dot add contact exists. If that guy exists, finally it goes off and it says, okay, does it handle that event? That's what the very last part of it does. If it doesn't handle that, if it handles that event, then it makes a call to it, and it calls tech-adept pages, calls that event, and it calls it with what's called a call instead of just doing the method exactly or directly. And does everybody know why it chose to do it that way? It's because of this. This, when you get an event, is pointing to the event. And you want to make sure that you know what this is pointing to. So when you say call, you can say call a method, and the very first thing that you give it is what you want this to be pointing to. And just to keep everything, in the case of an event, I actually do want it to be pointing to that event so that I can get things off of the off the page itself. So that's the golden ring piece of code. It does all the things to put the framework together. Any questions? Okay, so as I said before, we don't need to actually execute all those events. So for instance, on the add contacts, it's just the only real event it cares about is before show. So just before it's getting ready to show everything, it hooks onto there's two buttons on the page, a save button and a cancel button. It hooks those two buttons. C# programmers sometimes, and JavaScript or Java programmers sometimes have problems with this one aspect, a lot of inline functions in JavaScript. But if you really want to get a JavaScript and get comfortable with it, love inline functions. And the reason is because they preserve all the state. All the variables that exist outside of that inline function, but inside the function that you're in, exist inside of it. Whereas if I was to say, hey, call another method, I'd have to pass all those variables to that new function. And that takes overhead, it takes memory, and it takes time. So your code is a lot faster when you have inline methods as opposed to having those methods outside. And I know it's real tempting to put those methods on the outside because you're so used to seeing it in other languages. Or people say, oh, you want to separate your concerns. But really, the function boundaries serve as that separation. But having those functions inside of another function gives you so much more. Because I don't have, if I needed to know, any variables that are out here like this valid object, what I'm doing here is when you click the save button, I go through each of those buttons on that save markup has a class of input data on it. I grab all the ones that have the input data. I do a poor man's validation technique. which is basically seeing if they have a value. And in case you type all spaces and hit return, trim takes that all the way back down to 0 again. So I just make sure that if any of them doesn't have a value, I set valid object to false. And then I go ahead and for the ID matches what my models class uses as its properties. So for, I'll get a lot easier to show you guys. So if we look at this markup, you see first name, last name, telephone, and email contact. All of those match the properties of the contact class. And I'm just stripping off that add contact off of them and then putting them into a property list. And then telling the collection to update itself again. So each time I go through the loop, it's grabbing a new variable, stripping things off of it, putting stuff into it. When it comes out of that loop, out of that inline function, new contact still exists. That's another reason why I like putting my methods inside, inlining them instead of trying to do things external. And then I just check to make sure that I didn't check that the flag valid object is still good. If it is good, I go ahead and create a new object because everything that's inside of new context now is members of the contact class. And so I tell it to create this object and then go ahead and add it. Then the next thing I do is I just clear off all my input fields and then tell the collection class to render itself. And that's how everything got bumped up. And then I do a poor man's validation technique, which is if there's one or more objects that's not valid, I just say one or more fields are blank. You need to print them up and do the ubiquitous alert box, which would never fly in a production environment, although it can be quite useful. And so that's pretty much it. In a nutshell, that's pretty much all the code of the application. There's not much else that I've shown because the list itself is all done, the actual display of the list, that's all done by the backbone collection. All we do is add one. There's some HTTP messages that fire off, and everything else just happens almost automatically. So if we take a look again at our good friend Fiddler, and we go to the app, I can't ever think of a name easy. Not like it really matters what the phone number is or the email, just so there's some stuff in there. Like I said, this is not rock solid validation. So when we say save, we notice that we see an event come through, and in case you're not hip to Fiddler, it's one of my favorite tools. And the reason is because I can see everything going back and forth. Plus, it does one other thing that is invaluable if you're going to do mobile apps, and that is simulate performance. Because one of the things that happens, you're sitting there at work, you're on a gigabit network, and everything's really fast, and you're sending too much data and too chatty. But man, it's good because you're running on a quad-core Intel processor, and you've got your super fast network, and your servers on your own box. It looks great, and then you deploy to production. And the first thing that happens is everybody's going, I've been sitting here looking at this thing for 2 minutes for the first screen to display. Well, you can simulate slowing things down. It's still not as good as things being slow as they can be on a network. Because even if you're 4G, the person's too far from a transmitting power. The person just walked into a building. The person's moving around as they're doing things. Your connection goes on, up and down, and off and on, and it stops and it starts, and things like that. So you can see all the data that just went back. All the different variables are like that. Like I said, in the code itself, there's only the add, the list, the cut, and the delete are exercises for yourselves for homework. And I do believe that's about it for me. Any questions?